Last night my daughter-in-law called me again and asked if I was alone. When I told her no, she hung up. An hour later, someone tried to open my back door. I told her I wasn't alone. Maybe that lie is the only reason I'm still alive. It started a few weeks ago. Every night at exactly 9:30, my phone would ring. The first few times, I answered with a smile. Rachel had always been polite, attentive, almost too perfect in the way she spoke. She'd ask if I'd eaten, if I was sleeping well, if I'd locked the doors. Her voice always carried that soft concern that made me feel cared for, even if a little suffocated. At first, I thought it was sweet. After all, most people my age would be lucky if their children remembered to call once a week, much less every night. My son Michael was busy in Portland, working long hours at the construction firm he managed. So it was usually Rachel who called. I told myself she was just trying to fill the gap he left. But after a while, her questions started to change. Less about how I felt, more about what I was doing, who came by, whether I left the house, what time I went to bed. Once, when I said I had lunch with a neighbor, she asked for the woman's last name. Another time, she wanted to know if I still kept the spare key under the porch mat. It started to feel less like love and more like a checklist. That night, as the phone rang, I hesitated. I was sitting in my small living room, the one with the old wallpaper Robert had chosen decades ago, and the only light came from the lamp beside my chair. Outside, the orchard was quiet. Just rows of apple trees sleeping under the autumn sky. The phone rang again, steady and sharp. I answered on the third ring. Rachel's voice came through warm and careful. "Hi, Mom. How was your day?" "It was fine," I said. "Quiet." She asked if I was alone. I told her yes. There was a pause. Then, as always, she said she should let me rest and hung up. That was it. No goodbye. No good night. Just silence. I sat there, staring at the dark screen, wondering why those calls always left me uneasy. The house creaked with the wind, the kind of old sound you stop noticing after years of hearing it. But tonight it felt different, almost alive. I decided to lock the doors again, just in case. I checked the front, then the back. When I stepped into the mudroom, I noticed something strange. The back door latch was slightly bent, as if someone had tried to force it. My pulse quickened. I bent down, running my fingers over the metal. Fresh scratches. I froze. The phone rang again, loud in the quiet house. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight I was holding. I walked slowly back to the living room and answered. It was her again. "Mom, did I wake you?" "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She asked the same question. "Are you alone?" I hesitated this time. Every part of me wanted to say yes, but something stopped me. The image of that bent latch flashed in my mind. My voice came out quiet, almost whispering. "No." Rachel didn't respond right away. I could hear her breathing, soft and controlled. Then she said, "Oh, that's good. Who's with you?" I swallowed hard. "Just a friend. They're staying over." Another pause. Longer this time. Then she said, "That's nice. I'll call you tomorrow." When the line went dead, I felt the weight of my own lie settle over me. I set the phone down and turned off the lamp. The house fell into darkness, the kind that hums in your ears. I stood there by the window, staring out at the orchard. The moon was bright enough to outline the trees, pale and endless. That was when I saw it. A faint red light, blinking between the branches. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe from a car on the road. But there was no car. No sound of an engine. The light blinked again. Steady and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my old coat and stepped outside. The cold biting against my skin. The grass was wet with dew. The night air sharp and quiet. I moved slowly toward the trees, each step sinking into the earth. When I got closer, I saw it clearly. A small black camera, mounted on the trunk of the nearest tree. Its red light blinking. I stared at it for a long moment before pulling it down. It was small. No bigger than a deck of cards, with a strip of tape still stuck to the back. I turned it over, looking for a brand. But there was none. My hands trembled as I carried it back to the house. I set it on the kitchen table under the light. The lens was cracked slightly, but it was still recording. The battery light flashed. Someone had been watching me. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't even call Michael. I sat there for almost an hour, staring at the tiny thing like it might speak. Then I picked it up and slid it into a drawer. The phone rang again. I looked at it but didn't answer. The ringing stopped, then started again. I unplugged it. By midnight, the house was silent again, except for the ticking clock. I tried to sleep, but every sound made me flinch. I kept replaying that last call in my head. Her voice when I told her I wasn't alone. That small pause before she said it was good. Good. What did she mean by that? Sometime near dawn, I finally drifted off. I dreamed of Robert walking through the orchard, his face half hidden in fog. He was carrying a box. When he reached the edge of the trees, he turned and looked at me. He said something I couldn't hear, then vanished into the dark. When I woke, the sun was rising pale over the hills, and the air smelled like cold earth and apples. The phone sat silent on the table, the drawer where I'd hidden the camera slightly open. I poured myself a cup of coffee, trying to steady my hands. The light through the window felt thin, weak. I glanced toward the orchard, expecting to feel peace. But instead, I felt watched. That was when I decided to go into town. I needed to talk to someone. Maybe check my accounts. Make sure nothing had changed. I needed proof that I wasn't imagining things. As I locked the door behind me, I caught sight of something on the ground near the porch steps. A single muddy footprint, smaller than mine, pressed deep into the soil. I stared at it until the chill seeped into my bones. Then I looked toward the orchard one last time, the trees shifting in the wind, and thought of the blinking red light hidden among them. Whoever had been watching me was close. Too close. The morning air felt colder than usual, sharp and thin, as if the orchard itself was holding its breath. I poured my coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the fog stretch across the trees. The camera light I had seen the night before was gone, but I could not shake the feeling that it was still watching me somehow. I told myself it was probably a reflection, maybe from a passing car. But deep down, I knew better. After breakfast, I decided to drive into town. Red Willow was small enough that everyone knew each other. The kind of place where people waved even if they did not remember your name. The bank sat at the corner of Main and Cedar, an old brick building that had served the town for generations. I had some paperwork to update. Simple, routine things. Nothing about that morning was supposed to feel strange. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. A young teller named Megan smiled as she recognized me. Mrs. Brooks, it has been a while. How are the apples this year? I smiled back, said something polite about the late frost, and handed her my ID and account folder. She tapped a few keys on her computer, her smile fading into a polite confusion. That was the first warning sign. She asked if I had recently changed anything with my estate. Something about a power of attorney. I frowned, said no, and asked why. She hesitated, the way people do when they realize they may have stepped into something private. It says here that your financial records are being reviewed under guardianship verification, she said softly. Her voice dropped lower. According to this notice, a family member has filed to act as your temporary guardian until the court finalizes the paperwork. She turned the screen slightly toward me. I saw my name, my address, my account, and then, under authorized guardian, it said Rachel Brooks. My heart gave a slow, painful thud. That cannot be right, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. There must be a mistake. I never signed anything like that. Megan's eyes flicked nervously from the screen to me. Sometimes, these things happen through legal counsel, she said. Maybe it is a precaution, but I could tell she was uncomfortable. I thanked her, took my papers, and left before she could see the tremor in my hands. The drive back home blurred past. I barely remembered the turns. Rachel, my daughter-in-law, had always been polite, even warm in her way. Though never affectionate, she was practical to a fault. The kind of woman who liked lists and results, not feelings. After my husband Robert died, she had taken charge of Michael's career and their finances, building a life in Portland that seemed far from the quiet of this farm. I used to be grateful for her, thinking she gave Michael the direction he needed. But now the thought of her name on that document made my stomach twist. At home, I went straight to my desk. I opened the folder where I kept all my legal papers. The will, the deed, the insurance statements. Everything was in its place, neatly labeled, no signatures missing, no new forms added. Yet somehow, she had filed something with the court. She would have needed my information. My birth date, my social security number. Things only family would know. Things I had once given her when she helped file taxes for me. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same spot where I had found that camera light outside the window, the same place where she had called me every night. Her voice careful, measured, never quite soft. Maybe those calls had never been about caring. Maybe she had been checking if I was alone, making sure there were no witnesses. I pressed my hand to my mouth and tried to think. I needed to call someone. But who? Michael would take her side. At least at first. He always did. My closest friend, Lydia, lived 2 towns over and did not drive anymore. Sheriff Hall was kind, but without proof. He would just tell me to be cautious. I decided to give myself until tomorrow to think, to see if any more letters or calls came. That night, the phone rang at exactly 9:30. I stared at it until the 3rd ring before picking up. Her voice sounded the same as always. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in. You doing all right out there?" I hesitated before answering. "I am fine," I said. "Just tired." She asked if I had locked the doors. Then if I had talked to anyone in town. I told her no. She hummed, that little sound she always made when she was thinking. "Good. It is getting cold out there. Maybe you should think about staying with us for a while." The suggestion felt rehearsed, like she had said it out loud before making the call. I told her I liked it here, that the orchard needed me. She sighed softly, said she understood, and hung up. After the call, I locked every door twice. I sat in the dark, listening to the wind move through the trees. Each creak of the wood felt sharper, every sound heavier. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside again. Not footsteps exactly, but movement, like someone brushing past branches. I turned off the lamp and stood by the window. Nothing but shadows and fog. Yet when I looked down the driveway, I could swear a car had just pulled away, its taillights fading into the night. Sleep would not come. I made tea, sat at the table, and opened Robert's old notebook. He had written everything down: bills, harvest schedules, repair lists. The last entry was dated a week before he died. Meeting postponed. Read unstable. Must keep files separate. The handwriting was hurried. Unlike his usual neat script, I had never noticed that before. I traced the ink with my finger, wondering what it meant. Read. The name tugged at something. But the thought slipped away as fatigue settled over me. By dawn, I had decided to go back to the bank. Maybe speak to the manager this time. Not just the teller. I needed a copy of whatever paperwork had been filed. I also needed to find someone who understood how these things worked legally. Someone outside the family. But first, I would check the orchard. When I stepped out, the morning light was thin and gold. The kind that makes everything look peaceful, even when it isn't. Dew glistened on the grass. And for a moment, I almost convinced myself it had all been in my head. Then I saw it. Half hidden under the lowest apple tree near the fence. A fresh footprint. Deep and clear in the mud. Smaller than mine. The kind of shoe Rachel always wore. Those neat leather flats with the pointed toes. I crouched down. Touched the edge of the print. It was still damp. Someone had been there again. Sometime during the night. The wind moved through the orchard. Cold and soft. Carrying the faint scent of apples and something else. Metallic. Almost bitter. I stood there until the light changed and the shadows grew shorter. Trying to remember if Rachel had ever come out here alone before. She never liked the orchard. She always said it smelled too much like work. And yet, somehow, she had been here. In the dark. Under my window. I walked back to the house slowly. The phone ringing behind me before I even reached the porch. It was 9:30 in the morning. Too early for her usual call. I let it ring. I let the phone ring until it stopped. Then silence filled the house again. The air felt too still. Like the walls were listening. I poured another cup of coffee, even though my hands were shaking. I had barely slept. And the footprints outside kept flashing in my mind. I needed answers. And I needed someone who understood what was happening legally. Not just emotionally. By noon, I was back at the kitchen table flipping through old folders when I found an envelope marked Estate Correspondence. It was one of the packets Rachel had mailed me months ago when she helped file property taxes. I had trusted her enough to sign some of those forms without reading every line. My chest tightened. I might have handed her exactly what she needed to claim guardianship. The phone rang again. This time, I answered, hoping it was the bank manager. Instead, a calm male voice said, "Mrs. Brooks, my name is Daniel Pierce. I'm an attorney based in Salem. You don't know me. But I believe we have a mutual connection through your daughter-in-law. Rachel." I froze. It continued. "I was asked to prepare documentation for a competency hearing regarding your estate. But something didn't feel right about the paperwork. Would you be available to meet?" For a second, I thought it was another trick. But his tone was cautious. Sincere. We agreed to meet that afternoon at the cafe near the courthouse. I wrote down his name, his number, and the word hope beside it. It felt strange to trust a stranger. But at that moment, I needed someone who wasn't tied to my family. The drive into town felt endless. My old Subaru hummed along the highway, past the same pine trees and the same wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Red Willow." The town looked ordinary as always, which somehow made everything feel more unreal. Daniel was already sitting by the window when I arrived. Mid-40s maybe? Clean cut. Glasses. A notebook open in front of him. He stood as I approached. "Mrs. Brooks, thank you for coming." His handshake was firm but not pushy. We sat down, Ordered coffee. I watched him study me the way people do when they're trying to match what they've heard with what they see. He began carefully. I was contacted by Rachel about 2 weeks ago. She said you were having memory issues, that you'd misplaced important documents, and she was concerned for your safety. She asked me to prepare a guardianship petition. But when I received the supporting paperwork, I noticed the signature on your consent form didn't match your other records. I told her I needed to meet you in person, and she became defensive. Said you weren't well enough. That's when I decided to look into it myself. The words blurred together for a moment. I felt heat rising behind my eyes. She forged my signature, I whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. It appears so, but I can't accuse her without proof. Have you noticed anything unusual around the house? Cameras. Missing mail. Phone calls you didn't expect. I almost laughed at how neatly that described my last few nights. Cameras. Yes, I said. One in the yard. And calls. Every single night. He took a slow breath. Scribbling notes. I'd like to verify the filing myself, he said. There's a clerk I trust at the county office. In the meantime, keep everything as it is. Don't confront her yet. If she feels cornered, she'll act fast. I promised him I'd stay quiet, though every part of me wanted to call Rachel and scream. Instead, I thanked Daniel, paid for my coffee, and walked outside. The sky had that washed-out winter gray that always made the town look smaller. Across the street, an old pickup idled with its lights on. A man sat inside, looking at his phone. When I turned my head to check again, the truck pulled away. At home, the house greeted me with silence again. The envelope from Rachel still lay on the table. Open. I sat, forced myself to go through every piece of paper, every page she had touched. Bills, tax receipts, letters from the insurance company. At the bottom was one envelope I hadn't seen before. It had no return address, but it looked older. The paper slightly yellowed. I opened it carefully. Inside was a small memory card taped to a folded note. The handwriting wasn't Rachel's. It was Robert's. My breath caught. The note said, "Don't trust anyone about the partnership. Hiding evidence in the cold room. Floorboard 2. Protect yourself." I felt my pulse quicken as I walked down to the cellar. The air down there was cool and faintly sweet from the stored apples. I flicked on the single bulb. Against the far wall sat Robert's old tool chest. Metal. Dented. Still locked. The combination came back to me from muscle memory. I opened it and saw papers. Receipts. An old flash drive. And another folded letter. My knees nearly gave out as I sank onto the stool. The letter was short. His writing rushed. If you're reading this, I couldn't stop them. Reed knows too much. I'm keeping copies of the transfers in case something happens. You'll know what to do. Reed. The same name I had seen in Robert's notebook years ago. I looked around the room as if he might still be there, his presence clinging to the dust and wood. I didn't fully understand what I had found, but I knew it mattered. I also knew Rachel had been searching for something at the house. This was it. I took the flash drive and the note upstairs. My hands were trembling as I slipped them into a small tin and hid it under the loose board beneath the sink. Then I sat on the couch, staring at the fading light across the orchard. The quiet pressed against me until it was almost unbearable. The phone rang at exactly 9:30. Rachel's voice came through soft and steady. "Hi, Mom. How are you tonight?" I hesitated, my mind spinning. "Fine," I said carefully. She asked if I'd gone into town. I froze. Why would she ask that? I said no. She gave a polite laugh. Said she'd called the house earlier and no one answered. Maybe I was out walking. Her voice sounded calm. but I could hear the tension behind it. The need to know exactly where I had been. She was checking if I had met someone. I could feel it. When we hung up, I unplugged the landline from the wall. I couldn't stand the thought of her listening. I walked through each room, locking windows and doors, pulling curtains tight. Outside, the orchard shimmered faintly in the moonlight, rows of trees stretching into the dark. I went to the window where the camera light had flashed 2 nights earlier. Nothing now. Only the steady hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind. For a long time I stood there, clutching Robert's note in my hand. The phone on the kitchen counter lit up again, the screen glowing against the dark. Rachel's name. I didn't answer. The ringing stopped. A minute later, it started again. I pulled the cord from the outlet completely and sat in the dark, listening to my own breathing. Something was unraveling, and it was happening faster than I could think. Whatever Robert had been caught in, Rachel was continuing it. And somehow, all of it pointed back to me. Outside, an owl called from the orchard, a low, haunting sound that carried through the night. I shut off the light, pressed my palm against the cold window pane, and told myself to wait until morning. The next step would have to be careful. One wrong move, and Rachel would know I had found the box. Morning came heavy and gray, the kind of light that made every shadow look deeper. I hadn't slept. Not really. The house was too quiet. And every time the furnace clicked on, I thought it was footsteps. I made coffee, though I didn't drink much of it. My hands shook as I dialed Daniel's number from the note he'd given me. He answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, like nothing surprised him anymore. He said he'd managed to get a look at the court filing. Rachel had submitted it under an emergency petition, claiming I was exhibiting confusion, paranoia, and memory loss. She'd included a written statement from a doctor I'd never met and a notarized letter supposedly from me requesting her help. I felt my chest tighten. I never signed anything. Daniel said he believed me. He'd already contacted the clerk to delay processing the petition until the signatures could be verified. But that would only buy time. A few days, maybe. He advised me not to contact Rachel or Michael yet. Not until we knew who was backing the claim. Backing it. The words stuck in my mind. Rachel was calculating. But she wasn't clever enough to forge medical reports and manipulate court records on her own. Someone else was helping her. Someone with connections. I told Daniel about the letter and the flash drive I'd found. He asked me to describe it. When I mentioned Robert's note and the name Reed, he paused. Then he said quietly that he'd look into it. Something about that name sounded familiar to him. He promised to drive up the next day to examine the papers in person. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the kitchen wall. The ticking of the clock filling the silence. Robert's handwriting still burned in my memory. Don't trust anyone. Protect yourself. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling through the bare apple trees. I decided to check the cold room again, where Robert said he'd hidden evidence. Maybe there was more he hadn't mentioned. The door creaked as I pulled it open. The air smelled faintly of old wood and apples long gone. I moved aside crates and sacks of fertilizer, looking for anything out of place. Near the back corner, under a warped section of floorboard, I found a small gap filled with sawdust. I pried it open with a screwdriver and pulled out a second envelope. It was sealed with clear tape and heavier than the one before. Inside were several old photographs, a folded map, and a thin stack of papers covered in financial notes. The photos were faded, but I could still make out the faces. Robert was younger, standing beside a man in a dark suit I didn't recognize. On the back of one picture was written the name M. Reed, 1995. My pulse quickened. The papers were ledgers of some kind, with names, numbers, and what looked like offshore account details. At the bottom of one page, written in Robert's careful script, were the words "Final transfer complete. Safe, for now." A sudden noise from upstairs made me freeze. The sound of the front door opening. I held my breath and listened. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. I quietly slid the envelope back into the floor and pulled the board into place. My mind raced. It was too early for Daniel. And the sheriff never came unannounced. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a hammer, and crept up the stairs. The footsteps were in the kitchen now. I pressed myself against the wall. Heart pounding. Then a voice called softly. "Mom." Michael. Relief and fear hit me at once. I stepped out. He turned, startled to see me holding the hammer. "Whoa," he said, half laughing, though his eyes were tense. "You scared me." "What are you doing here?" I asked. My voice came out sharper than I meant. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Rachel was worried. You haven't been answering your phone. She said you sounded confused last night." I unplugged the phone. I said, "Too many wrong numbers." He nodded, still smiling, that careful, practiced smile. "I just wanted to check on you. Maybe stay the night. Make sure you're okay." Something about his tone felt rehearsed. I set the hammer down, keeping my distance. "I'm fine," I said. "You don't need to stay." He looked around the room, scanning the table, the counters. "Did someone come by? Rachel said there was an attorney trying to contact you. Pierce. I think." My stomach dropped. "How do you know about him?" "Rachel mentioned it. She said he's been bothering you, confusing you about the paperwork. You know how some people take advantage of widows out here." The lie slid out of him too easily. For a moment, I saw the boy he'd been, kind, loyal, but it was gone as quickly as it came. I crossed my arms. "What paperwork?" He hesitated. "The guardianship thing. It's just temporary. You'd still have control over most decisions. Rachel just wants to help." "By lying?" I asked. "By forging my signature." His face changed then. The way Robert's used to when he was caught in a half-truth. "Mom, maybe you don't remember. You signed something months ago. Before Dad passed. Rachel was helping with the taxes. It's possible. I remember what I signed." My voice cracked but stayed firm. "And it wasn't that." We stood in silence, the air heavy between us. Finally, he sighed, his tone softening. "Look, I don't want to fight. Let's just have dinner. Talk things through. Please." I wanted to believe him. I wanted my son back. The one who used to sit at this same table and tell me about his day. But I could see it now, the subtle glances. The way he positioned himself near the drawer where I kept the keys. I said I needed to get something from the cellar and went downstairs again. My hands trembled as I pulled out the flash drive from under the sink. I slipped it into my coat pocket and came back up, trying to act normal. Michael had already lit the stove and poured 2 glasses of wine. "To peace," he said with a small smile. I didn't touch my glass. We sat at the table. The conversation polite, careful. He asked about the orchard, the weather, my health, but every question felt like a test. Every smile, a performance. After an hour, he stood and said he needed to call Rachel. He stepped outside onto the porch. Through the curtain, I saw him pacing, his hand tight around his phone. His face was serious, angry. I took that moment to grab the envelope from the cellar and the letter from Robert. I hid them in the old pie safe behind the dining room wall paneling. When Michael came back in, his expression was forced calm again. "Rachel says hi," he said. "She might come up tomorrow." Tell her not to. I said. I need rest. He nodded, but I saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Sure. Mom, get some rest. He kissed my cheek and left. I watched his car disappear down the drive, the taillights cutting through the dark. When I turned back toward the house, I noticed something on the counter, his glass of wine. Untyaged. Next to a small black flash drive I hadn't seen before. It wasn't mine. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. A label on the side read M. Reed, contract. The air felt suddenly colder. I realized Michael hadn't forgotten it. He'd left it there on purpose. I held the flash drive in my palm and felt its weight like a secret pressed into my skin. It was small, cold, and heavier than it should have been. I knew Michael hadn't left it by accident. He wanted me to see it, to wonder what was on it. Maybe he wanted me to plug it in and trap myself. Maybe he wanted me to think he was still trying to protect me. I didn't know anymore. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual. The sound filled the empty space where conversation had been an hour earlier. I set the flash drive on the table, staring at the label. M. Reed, contract. That name again. Whoever Reed was, he connected everything. Robert's letters. Rachel's guardianship papers. Now this. I took a breath and went to the study. My old laptop sat on the desk. Slow but reliable. I hesitated before plugging the flash drive in. The screen flickered, then opened a folder titled Confidential. Inside were 2 files. One was a document named Reed Agreement 2010. The other? A single video file. The document opened first. It was a contract between Robert Brooks and a man named Marcus Reed. The letterhead belonged to a company I didn't recognize. Halberton Investments. The language was dense, full of legal terms. But one sentence caught my eye. Transfer of funds to be executed upon confirmation of property rights in Red Willow Estate. My stomach turned. It was my farm. Robert had promised it to this man. The video file started automatically. The screen showed my husband, Robert, sitting at his desk in this very room. His face was thinner, older than I remembered. He looked straight at the camera. If you're seeing this, he said, then Reed is trying to collect. His voice was rough, tired. He wasn't just an investor. He was laundering money through Halberton. And when I tried to get out, he threatened to take everything. I gave him partial access to the deed as collateral. Rachel knows. She helped manage the paperwork after my diagnosis. She said it was temporary, just a way to keep them calm. But I think she made her own deal. I froze. The screen flickered, then went black. I stared at my reflection on the laptop, my face pale and drawn. Rachel had known. For years, she'd known. And she'd used it. The phone on the table buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering. A man's voice. Low and measured. Mrs. Brooks. This is Marcus Reed. I believe you have something that belongs to me. My heart pounded so hard I thought he might hear it. I didn't respond. He continued. Calm. Confident. Your husband made an agreement. He received money he was not entitled to keep. That money was mine. I don't want trouble. I only want what's owed. I found my voice. Robert is dead. I know, Reed said. That's why I'm talking to you. The debt doesn't die with him. Rachel was supposed to handle this quietly. But you've complicated things. I'm not part of this, I said, my voice shaking. I didn't know. He said, I believe you, which is why I'm offering you a choice. Return what's mine, or I'll make sure you lose everything. The farm, your accounts, even your son. You have until tomorrow night. The line went dead. I stood there in silence. The phone still against my ear. My hands were trembling so hard I almost dropped it. I didn't know what he meant by return what's mine. Money, documents, the evidence Robert had hidden, whatever it was. Reed believed Rachel had promised to deliver it. That night, I called Daniel. He didn't pick up at first. But when he did, his voice was tense. I told him everything: the flash drive, the video, the call. There was a pause on his end. Then he said, "I know that name now. Marcus Reed was investigated years ago for corporate fraud. He disappeared before they could charge him. If he's involved, this is bigger than a family dispute." "What do?" I whispered. "Don't leave the house tonight. Lock every door. I'll be there at first light. And whatever happens, don't contact Rachel or Michael." After we hung up, I locked every window and turned off every light. I sat at the kitchen table with the hammer beside me, listening to the night. Hours passed before I heard it, the faint hum of an engine pulling into the driveway. Headlights swept across the wall. My breath caught. I peered through the curtain. It was a dark SUV. Its lights off now. I stayed perfectly still. The sound of a car door. Then footsteps on gravel. A man's shadow moved past the porch light, then stopped at the front door. A knock. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't answer. The knock came again. Louder this time. "Mrs. Brooks." A man's voice called, muffled through the door. "It's Marcus Reed. Let's talk like civilized people." I stepped back, clutching the hammer. He tried the handle, but it was locked. After a long moment, he laughed softly. "You can't hide forever." Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. I heard the crunch of gravel as he walked away. Then the car engine starting. When I was sure he was gone, I collapsed into the chair, shaking uncontrollably. At dawn, Daniel arrived. His car pulled up quietly behind the barn. He looked pale, serious, his eyes scanning the yard before he spoke. I told him everything that had happened. He took the flash drive from my hand and examined it. "We'll need to copy this somewhere safe," he said. "If Reed's desperate enough to come here himself, he's running out of options." He spent the next hour taking photos of the documents, the hidden letters, even the floorboard in the cellar. When he finished, he looked at me gravely. "You need to get out of this house tonight. Stay somewhere else. I'll go to the state police with what we have." But I couldn't leave. "Not yet. There's something buried here," I said. "Robert wrote about it. Evidence. If Reed finds it before we do, none of this will matter." Daniel hesitated. "Then we find it before he does." We worked for hours, checking every part of the orchard, every shed and storage room. The November wind bit through our coats. The ground was frozen, and the trees stood like silent witnesses. By late afternoon, we found a patch of disturbed soil near the old apple tree at the center of the orchard. The dirt was loose, darker than the rest. Daniel knelt and started digging. He uncovered a small metal box wrapped in plastic. Inside were more documents, a USB drive, and a note in Robert's handwriting. "If this reaches you, it's already too late. Reed will come for what he thinks is his. But this isn't about money. It's about what he did. And who helped him. The proof is here." Daniel looked at me. "We have to get this to the authorities." Before I could answer, the sound of an engine echoed from the road. I turned toward the driveway and saw a familiar car pulling in. Rachel's silver sedan. Daniel stood, his face pale. "She's not here to visit, is she?" "No," I said quietly. "She's here for the box." Rachel's silver sedan rolled up the driveway slow enough to make my pulse jump with every crunch of gravel. The wind carried the faint smell of exhaust mixed with the sweet rot of fallen apples. Daniel and I stood behind the tree. The metal box still half buried at our feet. He mouthed a single word. Hide. I ducked behind a low stack of crates while he moved the loose soil back over the hole. Rachel stepped out of the car wearing her usual tailored coat and gloves. Her hair pulled into a perfect knot like she was arriving at a meeting. Not a confrontation. Her heels clicked on the frozen ground. She called out my name softly. Almost tender. Like we were about to have tea together. I stayed quiet. Daniel crouched near the tractor. His phone already out. Recording. Rachel scanned the orchard as if she already knew where to look. Her voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge underneath. I know you found something. Helen. There's no point hiding it. Marcus won't wait much longer. The name hit the air like a slap. Daniel's eyes flicked to me. She was working with him. Rachel took a few steps closer to the apple tree. The ground crunched beneath her boots. You think I don't understand what you're doing. You want to believe Robert was some hero. But he wasn't. He made deals with dangerous men. And now you're putting us all at risk trying to play detective. Her voice cracked a little. Just enough to sound human again. Please. Just give me the box. Let me fix this before it gets worse. Daniel stood up from behind the tractor. Mrs. Brooks isn't giving you anything. His voice was calm but firm. Rachel's eyes widened. Who are you? Her attorney, he said, stepping forward. And I suggest you leave before we call the police. She laughed then. Cold and humorless. Police, do you really think they'll protect her? Reed owns half the county board. He's been paying people off for decades. You think a few papers in a box will change that? Daniel didn't move. The silence between them stretched until she finally spoke again. Softer. Michael didn't want to believe it. He still thinks you're confused. Helen. He doesn't know about the money. Or what happens if Reed decides you're no longer useful. Something in me broke hearing her say my son's name like that. Using it like a weapon. I stepped out from behind the crates. Rachel's eyes found mine immediately. You shouldn't have come here, I said. Neither should you. She replied. You should have stayed out of it. You forged my signature. You lied to my son. You've been stealing from me for years. How much did he pay you? Her face hardened. Enough to make sure my family survives. Enough to make sure your mess doesn't destroy ours. Daniel pulled his phone from his pocket and held it up. Everything you're saying is being recorded. I'd be very careful about what you admit to. Rachel's gaze flicked toward the orchard's edge. The sound of another engine cut through the wind. A dark SUV pulled up behind her car. Marcus Reed stepped out. Tall. Dressed in a black coat. His expression calm and deliberate. Good afternoon, he said. His voice smooth. I was hoping we could keep this civil. Rachel moved closer to him like she was relieved. I tried, she said quietly. She won't cooperate. Reed's eyes met mine. Sharp and assessing. You're Robert's wife. I remember him well. Smart man. Too honest for his own good. I didn't answer. He took a slow step forward. Robert and I had an understanding. He kept my accounts clean. And I let him keep his pretty little farm. But then he got greedy. Started keeping records he shouldn't have. Records you seem to have found. Daniel shifted beside me. If you take one more step, I'll call the police. Reed smiled faintly. Go ahead. They'll take at least 20 minutes to get here. We only need 5. I looked at Rachel. Her face pale now. Her confidence gone. For the first time, she looked afraid. Reed turned to her. You said the documents were complete. that everything would be handled quietly. They were, she stammered. I didn't know she'd find them. Reed's hand shot out, gripping her arm. She flinched. You had one job, Rachel. One. That was when Daniel moved. He stepped between them, raising his phone higher. Let her go. You're on camera. Mr. Reed. Reed's smile faded. For a moment, none of us moved. The orchard was silent except for the wind. Then he let her go. Rachel stumbled back, clutching her coat. I'm not a violent man, Reed said softly. I'm a businessman. I'll make you an offer. Mrs. Brooks, give me the box, and I'll disappear. No police. No hearings. No guardianship filings. You can keep your farm, your name, your peace. I stared at him. His words sounded almost kind, but his eyes were flat, cold. And if I say no, he shrugged, then I take it anyway. Daniel whispered. Helen, go inside. Now. But I didn't move. I'd been afraid long enough. I looked at Rachel, then at Reed. Robert didn't steal from you. You used him. You used everyone. He spent years afraid you'd come back. And now you have. But this time, you won't get what you came for. Reed's patience broke. He took a step forward. Daniel reached into his jacket, and Reed froze when he saw the glint of something metallic. A stun gun. Not a firearm, but enough to stop him. Rachel gasped. What are you doing? Daniel kept his eyes on Reed, making sure we both walk away from this. Then, before any of us could speak again, Reed's SUV door opened. Another man stepped out. Tall, broad, wearing gloves. His voice was rough. We done talking. Daniel took a step back, his grip tightening. Everything slowed. The sound of my heart was louder than the wind. Reed's lips curved into a faint smile. I think that's your answer. Rachel turned toward me, panic flashing in her eyes. Helen, give him the box. Please. He's not bluffing. I took a breath, every part of me shaking but steady enough to speak. No. Reed's man started walking toward us. Daniel pressed the phone's emergency button, the sound of the alert loud in the open air. The man hesitated, glancing toward the sound. That gave Daniel a split second. He lunged forward, grabbing my arm. Run. We sprinted toward the house, the frozen ground slick beneath our shoes. Behind us came shouting, the crunch of boots, then the roar of the SUV engine starting again. I didn't look back. By the time we reached the porch, my lungs were burning. Daniel slammed the door and locked it. He pulled a chair under the handle just as something crashed against the wood outside. They'll try to come around the back, he said. We need to get upstairs. We ran up the narrow staircase, the metal box still clutched in my hands. Through the window, I could see the orchard, the trees swaying under the gray sky. Somewhere out there, Marcus Reed was waiting, patient as a hunter. Daniel turned to me, his voice low and urgent. They won't stop. Not until they get proof that we can't hand them. What proof? I asked. He looked at the box, then at me. The kind that can send a man like Reed to prison for the rest of his life. Downstairs, the porch creaked again. Another sound followed, glass breaking. I tightened my grip on the box, forcing myself to breathe. Daniel reached for his phone. Backup's coming. Just hold on. The words barely registered. My eyes were fixed on the window, on the movement among the trees. A dark figure circling closer. I realized then that the orchard I had tended for 40 years, The place that had sheltered my family and held my memories had become a trap. And somewhere in that tangle of branches and shadows, my past was coming for me. I watched the dark figure move between the trees, slow and deliberate, like he knew exactly where we were. The old farmhouse creaked with the wind, each sound blending with my heartbeat until I could barely tell them apart. Daniel crouched near the window, phone in one hand, stun gun in the other. He whispered that the police were on their way, but his voice didn't sound convinced. Another crash came from downstairs, this time from the back of the house. The kitchen window. I heard glass shatter and boots hit the floorboards. Daniel motioned for me to stay behind him as he eased toward the hallway. My hands were still shaking around the metal box. It felt heavier now, as if it knew the danger it carried. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Then a voice, calm and steady. "Reed, you're only making this harder. Hand it over and nobody gets hurt." Daniel looked at me. His eyes said what his mouth couldn't run. He slipped into the hallway, moving quietly toward the stairs. I hesitated, torn between fear and fury. For 30 years I'd lived in this house, loved it, protected it. I wasn't about to hand it over to a man who thought he could walk in and take what he wanted. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved toward the back bedroom. I pushed open the closet door, knelt, and pulled up the loose board under the floor. It had been my hiding place for decades, where Robert and I kept spare cash and old letters. I slid the box inside, covered it with an old quilt, and replaced the board. Voices downstairs. Daniel shouting. A loud thud. I froze. Heart pounding. Then another sound. A muffled groan. Silence followed, the kind that presses against your chest. I forced myself to move, my body heavy with dread. I peeked into the hallway just in time to see Reed appear at the top of the stairs. His face was calm, his coat perfectly buttoned, his eyes cold. "You're making this very unpleasant, Mrs. Brooks," he said. "Where's the lawyer?" My throat was dry. "You should leave before the police arrive." He smiled faintly. "They're 20 minutes out." I checked. "That gives us plenty of time." Behind him, I saw Rachel step into view, her expression tight and pale. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at me. "Helen," she said softly, "just give it to him. Please. You don't understand what you're dealing with." "You think I don't," I snapped. "I lived through your lies, your forged papers, your calls every night pretending to care." Her eyes glistened, but I couldn't tell if it was guilt or fear. "You don't know what he's capable of," she whispered. Reed's hand shot out, gripping her arm. "Enough." He pushed her aside and stepped toward me. "Where is it?" "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, as if I were a child refusing to eat her vegetables. "I don't like games." He moved closer. I took a step back, my hand brushing against the table where Robert's old lamp sat. I remembered the heavy iron base and the way it used to wobble. He reached for me. Instinct took over. I grabbed the lamp and swung. The sound of metal connecting with flesh was sharp and awful. Reed stumbled, his hand going to his head, blood dark against his temple. I dropped the lamp, my hands shaking. Rachel screamed. "What did you do?" "He was coming at me," I said, breathless. "He was going to hurt me." Reed staggered but didn't fall. He straightened, eyes blazing. "You just made a very big mistake." Before I could move, he lunged. I stumbled back, hitting the wall. The impact knocked the breath from my chest. He grabbed my wrist, twisting hard. Pain shot up my arm. Then Daniel appeared at the top of the stairs, bruised but standing, the stun gun in his hand. "Let her go," he said. Voice hoarse. Reed turned just as Daniel fired. The crackle filled the hallway. A flash of light, followed by the smell of ozone. Reed jerked violently and collapsed to the floor. Groaning, Daniel rushed forward, grabbing my arm. "We have to move. Rachel, help me." Rachel hesitated, then nodded, tears streaking her face. Together, they dragged Reed toward the spare room and shut the door, wedging a chair under the knob. My knees gave out, and I sank to the floor. Trembling, Daniel knelt beside me. "You okay?" I nodded, though it wasn't true. My mind was spinning. He knew about the police. How? He's got someone feeding him information. Daniel said, "Probably local." He looked toward the window. "We need to hold out until backup gets here." Rachel leaned against the wall, arms wrapped around herself. "You don't understand," she said. "He's not alone. There's another man outside. He always brings one. He'll come when he hears the noise." Daniel's jaw tightened. Then we barricade the stairs. We worked quickly, dragging furniture from the guest room, stacking it across the landing. My body moved on instinct, fueled by adrenaline. Every sound from outside made my pulse jump. Minutes passed like hours. The wind howled around the house, and the trees outside rattled against the siding. Then, faintly, I heard it again, the crunch of boots on gravel. Rachel's face went white. "That's him." Daniel moved to the window. "Stay back." He peered through the glass, then cursed under his breath. "He's got a gun." My stomach turned to ice. "What do we do?" "Hide," he said. "Now." Rachel pulled me toward the bedroom. We slipped inside, closing the door quietly. I could hear Daniel moving outside, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Then, from downstairs, came the sound of splintering wood. The front door. Rachel pressed her hand to her mouth. "He's inside." I reached under the bed, my fingers brushing against the metal box I'd hidden earlier. It was still there, the last piece of Robert's secret. I clutched it to my chest. Footsteps climbed the stairs, slow and deliberate. A man's voice, rough and steady. "Reed, you good." No answer. He tried the spare room door, then rattled it harder. "Reed." Rachel's eyes were wide with terror. I could feel her trembling beside me. Daniel's voice came from the hall. "Police are on their way. You should leave now." A pause. Then a gunshot shattered the silence. Rachel gasped. I grabbed her arm and pulled her to the floor. Another shot. Closer this time. The sound echoed through the old house, vibrating through the walls. I couldn't tell if Daniel was hit. The footsteps moved again, closer to our door now. My breath caught. Rachel whispered, "Please, Helen, give him the box. Just give it to him." I shook my head. "If we do, no one will ever know what they did. Robert, your father-in-law. All of it will vanish." She pressed her palms to her face, crying quietly, "He'll kill us." The knob turned. Slowly, I tightened my grip on the box. My heartbeat, a drum in my ears. The door creaked open an inch. A shadow fell across the floor. Then the wail of sirens broke through the night. Red and blue lights flickered through the window, reflecting off the walls. The footsteps stopped. Outside, someone shouted, "Sheriff's Department, drop your weapon." Rachel sobbed, collapsing against me. I could hear the chaos below, the pounding of boots, the shouting of commands. Another shot, then silence. I didn't move until the heavy sound of doors slamming told me it was over. Daniel appeared in the doorway a moment later. Pale but standing. "It's done," he said softly. "They got him." The relief hit me so hard I nearly dropped the box. I looked down at it, still cold in my hands, and realized that the fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. The flashing lights painted the orchard in streaks of red and blue, the trees swaying under the weight of wind and sirens. I sat on the floor, clutching the metal box, the sound of radios and footsteps filling the house. 2 deputies moved quickly through the hallway, their boots leaving wet prints on the old wood. Rachel sat beside me, pale and silent, staring at nothing. Daniel stood near the doorway, speaking quietly to the sheriff. When the chaos finally settled, Sheriff Grant crouched down in front of me. He was a broad man with a kind face, lines of exhaustion cutting deep around his eyes. "It's over, Mrs. Brooks," he said gently. "Reed's dead. His man's in custody. We'll need a statement from you and your attorney." I nodded, unable to find words. My body felt heavy, my mind still tangled in the sound of gunfire. I could still see Reed's eyes before he fell. That strange calm, as if he'd always known this was how it would end. Rachel spoke up suddenly, her voice sharp and brittle. "You don't understand. There's more. He wasn't working alone. There are people in the county, in the bank. They'll come for us if they find out what's in that box." The sheriff looked at her, his tone cautious. "Let's start with what's in it, ma'am." I looked down at the box in my lap. My hands were still trembling, but I forced the lid open. Inside were stacks of documents, old photographs, and another small drive wrapped in plastic. Daniel leaned closer as I lifted one of the papers. It was a contract, dated nearly 15 years ago, between Halberton Investments and several shell companies I'd never heard of. Attached to it was a list of names: judges, county officials, and 2 people I recognized immediately. The first was Robert's old business partner. The second was the name of the current county commissioner. Daniel whistled under his breath. "This isn't just fraud. It's organized corruption. And if Reed was the middleman, this connects a lot of powerful people." The sheriff's expression darkened. "We'll take this into evidence. But I'm going to be honest with you, Helen. If what's here is real, it's going to shake this town." Rachel let out a shaky laugh. "You think they'll let that happen? You don't know these people. They'll bury it before it ever sees a courtroom." Daniel turned to her. "Then we make sure it doesn't stay buried." The sheriff took photos of the documents before sealing the box in an evidence bag. He gave me a reassuring nod. "You'll be safe tonight. We'll have a deputy stay outside until morning." But when the cars finally pulled away, leaving only one cruiser parked by the gate, the silence returned. The house felt different, emptier. I went downstairs and made tea with shaking hands, the scent of chamomile filling the air. Rachel followed quietly, sitting at the table like she didn't know where else to go. Neither of us spoke for a long time. "Finally," she said. "I didn't want it to go this far. Marcus said it would be clean, that no one would get hurt. I just wanted to protect Michael." I looked at her, tired beyond anger. By lying to him, by trying to take everything I built. She flinched. "You don't understand. When Robert died, the debts didn't. Marcus said he'd ruin Michael's business, take everything if I didn't help. So I did what I had to." "You forged my name," I said quietly. Tears filled her eyes. "I know. I thought it was temporary. I didn't think he'd come here himself. I thought he just wanted proof the documents were gone." I wanted to believe her, but the ache in my chest told me the truth was somewhere in between. She wasn't innocent, But she wasn't heartless either. Just trapped. Like the rest of us. Daniel came in from the porch. His coat dusted with frost. State police will take over in the morning. They'll send the evidence to the district attorney's office in Portland. Until then, we don't talk to anyone. No calls. No emails. Rachel's voice was small. And Michael? Daniel looked at me before answering. He needs to know. But not tonight. Let the facts speak first. After he went upstairs to make calls, I sat in silence, staring at the steam rising from my cup. My whole life had been built around this house, this land, this illusion of safety. And now I knew every nail. Every brick carried secrets. Robert had tried to protect us. But in doing so, he'd tied us to something that refused to die. Outside, the orchard glowed faintly under the patrol lights. I thought about how many seasons those trees had seen. How many storms they'd survived. Maybe. I told myself. That was what endurance looked like, not peace. But persistence. When I finally stood, Rachel was still at the table. Her face pale against the yellow light. You should rest, I said. She looked up at me. Her eyes red. You hate me. Don't you? I hate what you did, I said. But I understand why you did it. She nodded slowly, like she'd been waiting for that answer. Michael doesn't deserve this. Promise me you won't turn him against me. I hesitated. That depends on what you tell him when he asks. She didn't respond. I went upstairs and left her sitting there, her shoulders trembling in the dim light. When I reached my bedroom, I found Daniel sitting by the window, his phone on the table beside him. He looked tired but focused. You should get some sleep, he said. You've been through enough for one night. I don't think I can, I admitted. Every time I close my eyes, I hear his voice. He nodded slowly. People like Reed always think they're untouchable. But they all make mistakes. And thanks to Robert, we have proof of his. I moved closer to the window, looking out at the orchard. The moon had risen higher, its light silver on the frosted ground. Robert always said the truth had roots. I murmured. I think this is what he meant. Daniel smiled faintly. Then we'll make sure it grows. For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. Not peace, but clarity. The kind that comes after years of fear and silence. The kind that hurts and heals at the same time. Downstairs, a door creaked. I turned sharply, listening. It wasn't the wind this time. Rachel's voice drifted up, low and hurried, speaking to someone outside. Daniel and I moved toward the stairs quietly. Through the window, I saw her near the patrol car, talking to the deputy. She handed him a folded envelope. Daniel's jaw tightened. What is she doing? I couldn't hear their words, but the deputy nodded, slipping the envelope into his coat before getting back in the cruiser. Rachel turned, glancing up toward the house, her expression unreadable. When she came back inside, she jumped slightly at the sight of us waiting. It's nothing, she said quickly. He just needed my statement. Daniel didn't answer. He just watched her, his face hard to read. She brushed past us and went to the guest room, closing the door behind her. I looked at him, my heart sinking. Do you think she's lying again? He picked up his phone. I think we'll find out in the morning. The house fell quiet again, but the calm felt fragile, stretched thin over something waiting to break. I went to my room and lay awake until the first gray light of dawn touched the orchard, wondering if the truth Robert left behind would save us or destroy what was left of our family. The morning light was thin and gray, crawling across the orchard like smoke. I had not slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Reed's face and the flash of red and blue lights against the trees. Downstairs, I heard Daniel moving quietly, making a call. The low hum of his voice was the only sound in the house. I dressed and went down. The floorboards cold beneath my feet. The air smelled faintly of burned coffee. Daniel hung up as I entered, his expression grim. State police confirmed the files. The names. The accounts. All of it checks out. Reed was running money for Cascade Equity through Halberton. They're already coordinating with the FBI. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. The events of the night before felt distant, like someone else's story. What about Rachel? I asked quietly. She's still here, Daniel said. But that deputy she talked to, he's missing. His cruiser never checked back into the station after his shift ended. I felt my stomach twist. She gave him something last night. An envelope. He nodded. If it's what I think. She was trying to buy time. Maybe silence. Before I could answer, the sound of a car pulling into the drive broke through the quiet. We both turned toward the window. It was Michael's truck. He got out quickly, slamming the door, his face tight with worry. Rachel came out of the guest room just as he stepped inside. Michael, she said, softly. You shouldn't be here. He ignored her, his eyes darting between us. I got your message. What the hell is going on? The news said there was a shooting here last night. Daniel stepped forward. Michael, sit down. There's a lot you need to know. He looked at me, his voice breaking. Mom, what happened? I told him everything. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it wavered when I spoke about Robert. The files, Reed's threats, and the night he came for the box. I told him how Rachel had been working with him, at least at first, and how she'd forged my name. When I finished, the room was silent. Michael stared at the table, his hands clenched. Is that true? He asked Rachel. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Then finally, she whispered, yes, but it's not what you think. I was trying to protect us. Protect us, he said, his voice rising. By stealing from my mother, by lying to me. She reached for him, but he pulled away. You don't understand what it was like, she said. Reed had control over everything. Our accounts, our loans. He said he'd destroy you if I didn't help. He shook his head. And you didn't think to tell me. I thought I could fix it, she said. I thought I could make it go away. Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then at me. The sheriff's outside. They want us all to come down to the station. The FBI agents from Portland are already there. Rachel looked terrified. You can't let them take me. Please. Helen. I didn't mean for any of this. I felt something ache deep in my chest. A mix of pity and exhaustion. You made your choices, Rachel. Now you have to live with them. The drive to town was quiet. Rachel sat in the back seat, staring out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Michael drove, his jaw set, eyes forward. Daniel rode beside him, speaking occasionally on the phone. The town looked almost ordinary under the gray morning sky, as if it hadn't been turned upside down in a single night. At the sheriff's office, 2 agents were waiting. They introduced themselves as Special Agents Harper and Lawson. Their manner was professional but watchful, like they were measuring every word we said. They questioned us separately. When it was my turn, I told them everything again. Harper took notes while Lawson recorded the session. When I mentioned the forged guardianship papers, they exchanged a quick look. Lawson asked, "Did your daughter-in-law ever mention working for Cascade Equity?" "Yes," I said. "She handled their books years ago, before she married my son." I didn't think anything of it then. He nodded slowly. She was still listed as a financial consultant for one of their shell companies until last year. It looks like Reed used her to move funds quietly through family accounts. Your estate was one of them. It made sense now. The transfers, the sudden interest in my property, the calls every night. They were keeping tabs, making sure nothing slipped. When the interview ended, I stepped into the hall. Michael was sitting on a bench, his face buried in his hands. He looked up when he saw me. They're charging her, he said quietly. Conspiracy, fraud, obstruction. 15 years if she's lucky. I sat beside him. I'm sorry, Michael. He shook his head. You don't need to be. I just keep thinking about how blind I was. She said she was helping with the business, and I believed her. I didn't see any of it. I wanted to comfort him, but I didn't know how. Some pain can't be softened by words. That afternoon, the agents came out with Rachel in handcuffs. She looked smaller somehow, her confidence gone. As she passed me, she whispered, "Tell him I'm sorry." Michael didn't answer. He just watched as they led her to the car. When the car pulled away, Daniel joined us. It's done, he said quietly. Reed's network is coming apart. They've already issued warrants in Portland and Eugene. The DA's office thinks this case could expose half of Cascade's investors. I looked at the gray sky above the courthouse, the clouds heavy with rain. And Robert, I asked, will they clear his name? Daniel smiled faintly. They already have. The letter you found. The files those proved he was trying to stop them, not help them. His record will be reinstated. I felt the tears before I realized I was crying. The air smelled of rain and pine. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Michael put his hand on my shoulder. He'd be proud of you. Mom. Maybe, I said softly, but he'd also be sad it came to this. As we walked back to the truck, I looked once more at the town square, at the people passing by with their umbrellas and grocery bags. Life went on, indifferent to the storms that had blown through mine. When we reached the farm, the orchard was quiet again. The deputy's cruiser was gone, replaced by a calm I hadn't felt in months. Daniel promised to stay a few more days, to make sure everything was settled with the FBI. That night, after they'd both gone to bed, I stood by the window and looked out at the trees. The moonlight turned the frost silver, and the branches swayed softly in the wind. I thought about Robert, about the years we spent here, building something simple and honest, never knowing what shadows were growing underneath. The truth had taken almost a decade to surface, but now it was free, and so was I. In the distance, an owl called, long and low. I closed the curtains and whispered goodnight to the man I had loved, to the son who still needed healing, and to the woman I had once been before all of this began. Then I turned off the light and let the dark fold around me, quiet and complete. Morning came soft and golden, spilling over the orchard like a quiet promise. The frost had melted overnight, leaving the grass wet and shining. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the trees sway gently in the light breeze. For the first time in a long time, the house felt still in a way that wasn't lonely. The silence no longer frightened me. It just felt like rest. Michael was already outside, fixing the latch on the old barn door. He had been staying here for 2 weeks now, helping around the farm. The work kept him busy, gave him something to hold on to. I watched him from the window, his shoulders bent in focus, and saw a piece of his father in him that I hadn't noticed in years. When he came back inside, he smelled of sawdust and cold air. He smiled a little, tired but genuine. "The barn's good as new," he said. "It just needed a few bolts." "Your father would have done it the same way," I said. He nodded and poured himself coffee. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment. "Maybe I could move back here for a while. Just until I figure things out." I looked at him, trying to read his face. There was guilt there, but also something steadier. I reached over and touched his hand. "You're always welcome here," I said. "This place is still yours as much as it's mine." The air between us softened. For the first time since everything happened. He didn't look haunted. I knew it would take time for him to forgive himself. And maybe longer to forgive her. But time had a way of healing what fear couldn't. The news had spread across Red Willow and beyond. Cascade Equity had been dismantled. Its executives arrested. The district attorney called last week to thank me for my cooperation. Though it didn't feel like gratitude belonged to me. It belonged to Robert, who had seen the truth before anyone else, and to Daniel, who had believed me when no one else did. Daniel stopped by that afternoon. He looked different now. Calmer, like a man who had finally slept after a long war. He brought a folder from the court, along with a quiet smile. "It's official," he said, placing the papers on the table. "The guardianship claim is void. All assets return to your name. The state has recognized Robert's death as accidental, not suspicious. His record is cleared." I felt tears blur my vision as I touched the folder. The weight that had lived on my chest for 9 years finally began to lift. "Thank you," I said softly, "for everything." He smiled. "You did the hard part." Michael joined us, wiping his hands on a towel. Daniel looked at him, then at me. "The Bureau may ask you to testify later. But for now, you're both free to live your lives. No one's watching anymore." The words sank in slowly. No one's watching. After years of fear and control, it sounded almost strange. Freedom had a silence to it that I wasn't used to. That evening, after Daniel left, I walked through the orchard. The branches were bare now, but buds were already forming, small and stubborn against the cold. Robert used to say the trees always knew when it was time to begin again. I ran my hand along the rough bark and felt the truth in that. As I reached the center of the orchard, the spot where everything had begun, I stopped. The soil there was smoother now, the scars of digging covered by grass. The wind carried the faint scent of apples from the bins near the barn, sweet and earthy. I closed my eyes and could almost hear Robert's laugh, low and warm, the way it used to fill this place. When I went back to the house, the sun was setting. Michael was in the living room, sorting through old photographs. He looked up as I entered. "I found this," he said, holding up a picture of Robert standing by the orchard, his arm around me. I smiled, remembering the day it was taken. It had been just before the harvest. The sky clear and blue. The trees heavy with fruit. "He'd be proud of you," Michael said quietly. I shook my head. "No. He'd be proud of us. We survived what tried to break us." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I still can't believe Rachel's gone. I don't even know what I'm supposed to feel anymore." "You'll figure it out," I said. "Grief doesn't move in straight lines. It circles until it finds a place to rest." He leaned back, staring at the photo again. "You think people like her ever realize what they've done?" I thought about it for a long moment. Maybe not until they lose what they thought they were fighting for. That night, I couldn't sleep. So I went back outside. The stars stretched wide across the sky, cold and endless. The house behind me glowed with soft yellow light. I stood there, breathing in the stillness. No more late-night calls. No more fear of footsteps or shadows in the yard. Just quiet. I whispered into the night. It's over. Robert. We're safe now. A single apple hung from one of the trees nearby. Small and wrinkled. Clinging to its branch despite the frost. I plucked it. Held it in my palm. And smiled. There was something about that stubbornness that felt right. Life holding on even when the season had ended. When I went back inside, I found Michael asleep on the couch. The photo still in his hand. I covered him with a blanket and turned off the lamp. The floor creaked softly under my feet. Familiar and comforting. In the kitchen, I poured myself one last cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the faint glow of moonlight on the orchard. The world outside was still and kind again. It didn't erase what had happened, but it gave it meaning. Every storm leaves something behind. Sometimes it's ruin. Sometimes it's roots. I thought about Rachel, about the choices that had led her to this. And I felt no hatred, only sadness. She had been consumed by fear the same way I had. Only hers had turned to greed, while mine had turned to silence. Maybe that was the only difference between us. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the end of a chapter I never wanted to live, but was grateful to have survived. I breathed deeply, feeling the warmth of the tea. The weight of peace settling where grief had lived for so long. The house felt whole again. Not because everything was fixed, but because I finally understood it didn't need to be. Healing isn't perfect. It's honest. As the first light of dawn touched the fields, I stood and whispered to myself, "It's time." Tomorrow I would prune the trees, bake the first pie of the new season, and send a small crate of apples to the sheriff's office as a thank you. Maybe even visit the church again. Life, as it turns out, keeps going even when you think it can't. I looked out one last time at the orchard and smiled. Some endings are quieter than others, but they're still endings. And sometimes, quiet is exactly what you need. If you've ever had to rebuild after someone broke your trust, if you've found strength where you thought there was none, tell me. I want to hear how you made it through. Because stories like ours deserve to be remembered.